He gave his worst lot to the neighbor. 2 months later, he was surprised. Arthur Harrison woke up that Monday with a weight that wasn't just physical. It was the kind that settles inside, right at the sternum, and doesn't go away even when you get up, even when you have your first coffee. He stood at the edge of the bed for about 2 minutes, eyes open, listening to the wind slowly tapping against the window shutter. $19,000 in debt, and 40 days to pay. The harvest that year had been a disaster. The rain came late, inputs got expensive, and the prices of crops plummeted just when he needed to sell at a good price the most. Arthur understood the land. He knew how to read the sky, knew when the soil was thirsty, knew how to plant corn, soybeans, and beans at a rhythm that few people around there still mastered. But debt wasn't soil. Debt couldn't be watered, couldn't ripen in due time. Debt grew on its own at night and swallowed what you planted during the day. What hurt the most wasn't the amount itself. It was knowing that for 3 years, since he had been alone at the farmstead, he had been doing everything to keep that piece of ground standing. And the ground was winning the fight. The farmstead had 2 parts, the one he called the good acre and the one he called the back 40. The good acre was where the crops that sustained the house were planted, where the dark, moist soil responded to work with a loyalty he respected as if it were a living being. The back 40 was another story. A strip of land that went from the end of the cedar post fence to the boundary with the neighbor's lot. 6¼ acres of reddish soil, dry as old leather, that had produced nothing of value for over 12 years. Arthur's father had tried everything there: beans, squash, fodder grass for pasture, sorghum. Nothing took hold properly. The back 40 land was, in the words of old Clifford Harrison, beautiful on the outside and ungrateful on the inside. Arthur never sold that piece because selling land felt like betraying something he couldn't name. It was family land. But that morning, stepping out the back door with his worn straw hat on his head and his thick work boots on his feet, looking at that orange, dried-up expanse, he thought for the first time, maybe the old man was right. Maybe that piece was just God-forsaken ground, as his father used to say, laughing. That's when Silas appeared at the fence. Silas Miller was 54 years old, with a thin mustache and the eyes of someone always calculating something in silence. He had been Arthur's neighbor for almost 15 years, and the two had never exactly been friends. Good neighbors, if you can call it that. They greeted each other when they crossed paths on the gravel road, lent each other tools from time to time, but each lived their life on their side of the fence without invading the other's space. "Good morning, Mr. Arthur," he said, leaning on the fence post with his arms crossed. Arthur lifted his chin in response, as men from the rural Midwest do, who think words are only necessary when needed. "I wanted to make you a proposal." Proposal was a word that at that moment carried 2 possible flavors. Either it was salvation or more trouble. Arthur stayed quiet, waiting. "That back 40 lot. I want to work it. Plant something." Arthur looked at the arid soil, then looked at Silas with an expression that said almost everything without needing words. "Plant what? Sand?" "Watermelons," said Silas, and he said it as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Arthur stayed quiet. Then he let out a short breath, like someone who heard something unexpected. "Watermelons, in this ground here. In this ground here. Silas, my father tried everything on this piece. Nothing grows. Even weeds barely make it there." "I know," he said without looking away, "but I want to try anyway." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and hit like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us beginners. Now, back to the story. What happened next, Arthur Harrison would carry in his memory for the rest of his life. He hadn't planned what he said. It came out like a sigh, without warning, without thinking. One of those moments when the tongue does what the heart decides before the head has time to step in. Take it. If you can make something grow in that soil, the land is yours. Silas didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't reach out to shake his hand. He just nodded slowly, as if he already knew he was going to hear that. And that's exactly when the real trouble started. 3 days later, Arthur's son showed up out of the blue. Nathan was 42, worked at an office in Chicago 4 hours away, and had a habit of showing up when least expected with that look of someone about to fix something nobody asked him to fix. He arrived in his new pickup truck, with his wife Brenda in the passenger seat and a folder of documents under his arm that Arthur recognized from a distance. "Dad, we need to talk." Those words. Anyone who's ever had a grown child knows the weight they carry when spoken in that tone. Arthur sat down on the porch, crossed his arms and waited. Nathan opened the folder with the care of someone about to reveal something important. There was a purchase offer for the whole farmstead. An outside company was buying up land in the area for a large-scale project. The price was fair, not what Arthur thought the land was worth, but it covered the debt with plenty left over and would still leave a nice nest egg. "Dad, you're 68 years old. You're here alone, in debt, on a farm that's not producing what it should. You deserve to rest." Brenda, on the other side, nodded silently in agreement. Arthur looked at her for a second, then back at his son. "Rest where?" "You come live with us. We have a spare room." Arthur was quiet for a time that felt long to everyone sitting on that porch. Then he said slowly, without anger, but with a firmness that made it clear the matter was settled, "I'm not going to live off a spare room in my son's house." But Nathan didn't leave. He stayed 3 days. And on the second day, when he found out about the Back 40 story, he became a whirlwind. "You gave away the land? Just like that? To Silas?" "I told him if he could plant something there, it was his." "Dad, that land has value. Even if it's bad for crops, it has location value, acreage value. There's nothing, Nathan. There's a promise I should have made years ago." The argument was long and exhausting, as all arguments are that have no winner because each side has its own reason. Nathan saw numbers in everything. Arthur saw the land. They had never spoken the same language on this point, and during those 3 days it became clear, in a way that hurt them both, that they probably never would. When Nathan left, Arthur stood on the porch watching the dust the pickup truck kicked up on the gravel road, and he felt something he tried to call relief, but it was really loneliness. That specific kind of loneliness that only happens when the person who left is someone you love but can't understand. There are things you hear and feel like you know that pain from somewhere. In the weeks that followed, Arthur focused on his own crops. The drought that came in April was more intense than expected, and he needed every bit of attention to protect what he had. The farmstead's well dropped faster than in other years, and he had to ration irrigation with a surgeon's care. Some rows of corn suffered just the same, lost about 20% of what he expected to harvest, and on top of all that, the creditor sent a representative out to the farmstead. A middle-aged man in city clothes, with an air of politeness that wasn't politeness at all, came and sat in the same chair where Nathan had sat, and explained in a slow, courteous tone that the deadline was approaching. If there was no payment, the next conversation would be at the notary's office, with other parties involved, and could lead to measures neither of them wanted. Arthur thanked him for the visit as if he were a regular guest, served him coffee, walked him to the gate with a raised hand in farewell. Inside, his stomach was in knots. All this time, when he made his rounds around the farmstead, he'd go near the Back 40, but stay on the outside of the cedar post fence. He'd see Silas from a distance, working with his 2 teenage sons, those boys about 15 and 17, with the same calculating eyes as their father. He'd see the marks of tools in the soil, the precisely drawn lines, that constant silent activity that didn't match what he expected to find on ground that had never responded to anyone. But he wouldn't get close. Pride, maybe. Or fear of seeing that it wasn't working and having to face his own mistake in silence. It was that week that Mrs. Pearl showed up at the gate. Pearl was Silas's mother. 75 years old, small as a sparrow, with her white hair pulled back in a tight bun at the nape of her neck, and dark, lively eyes that seemed to be watching everything at once. She had lived with her son since she was widowed, about 10 years back, and was rarely seen off their property. A quiet presence, the kind you know exists but never really know much about. That afternoon she knocked on Arthur's gate with a jar of homemade apple butter in her hand, and the manner of someone who had come to truly visit, not just drop off sweets. "Mr. Arthur, may I sit a while?" He pulled a chair out for her and stood leaning against the porch post, waiting. "I wanted to tell you something," she began, smoothing her apron over her lap, "about that piece of land, the back 40. Something I should have told you before, but it wasn't my story to tell." Arthur paid attention in a different way. Something in how she said it made him straighten his back. "About 12, 13 years ago," Pearl continued slowly, choosing her words, "Mrs. Martha came to see me. She had planted some watermelon seeds on that patch in the back 40, just out of curiosity to see what would happen. And it grew. It grew beautifully, she told me. She came to tell me about it all excited, with that way she had of being happy about small things. But then the rain that year came too hard, out of season, and ruined everything before it could ripen. She got it in her head that that soil had something special that people weren't seeing." Arthur went very quiet. Pearl didn't look away. "Only, at that time, you were going through a health problem, remember? You were in the hospital for quite a while, and she didn't want to worry you about planting on that land while you were recovering. She asked me to keep it to myself, said she'd tell you when the time was right." She paused briefly. "The right time never came, and Martha left before it could." I had to stop right there when I first read this part, pause for a moment before going on. Because there are things you discover about the people you loved that you'll never be able to thank them for. They're already gone. And you're left holding that information in your hands, not quite knowing where to put it. Arthur stared off at the horizon for a time neither of them measured. Pearl stayed beside him, quiet, with the jar of apple butter in her lap, the way truly wise people know how to be, present without weighing down. "Did Silas know about this?" he asked at last, his voice a little rougher than usual. "I told him after you gave him the land. He already wanted to try planting there on his own, just by instinct. But when he heard about Martha's story, it made him even more certain he was doing the right thing." Arthur nodded very slowly, like someone digesting something they're in no hurry to swallow. That night, after Pearl left, he sat on the porch for a long time without turning on the light. The darkness of the back 40 was there just like always, but something had changed in the way he looked at that darkness. In the following days, he started getting closer to the cedar post fence during his rounds. He would stand a few yards away, watching. He saw Silas and the boys working with a regularity that seemed almost ritual. Early in the morning, before the heat set in, and in the afternoon when the sun went down, he saw the tracks of the irrigation hose pulled in a way he'd never tried on that piece of land. He saw the earth that had always been one color gaining darker patches here and there where the moisture held, but he still didn't go near, not yet. May passed by like that. The creditor sent a second notice in writing, with a tone a little less polite than the first visit. Nathan called at the end of the month, asking if his father had changed his mind about the buyout offer. Arthur said he hadn't, and hung up without prolonging the conversation. And then came the beginning of June. On a Tuesday morning, before the sun had fully risen, when the air still carried that damp chill that dawn leaves in the fields, Silas knocked on Arthur's door. When the door opened, he didn't say good morning. He didn't say anything about the weather or anything else. He said only 2 words, "Come see." And he turned his back, waiting for Arthur to follow. Arthur grabbed his hat from the hook and went. They walked without talking to the cedar post fence. Silas opened the wire gate he himself had put in during the weeks of work and pointed ahead with a simple gesture, like someone presenting something that words couldn't prepare you for. What Arthur saw on the other side wasn't the arid reddish ground he'd known since childhood. It wasn't that orange stretch that had never given way to anything. It was green. Green in a way he hadn't expected. Not in 2 months, not on that soil. Row after row of watermelons stretched across the back 40 land, round and firm, striped dark green over light green, covered in the cold dew of early morning, shining under the first ray of sun that cut the horizon as if someone had scattered something precious across all that ground. They reached as far as the eye could see, hundreds of them maybe, big ones, sitting heavy among the broad, lush leaves of the vines that took over the entire plot. Arthur stood at the edge of the field with his mouth open, his right hand slowly rising to his chest without realizing he was doing it, his straw hat slightly crooked on his head, his calloused hands from decades of work suspended for a second before lowering slowly. "How?" was the only word he managed to say, and it came out hoarse. Silas stood beside him, hands in his pockets, looking at the field with the calm of someone who had worked for it and knew what he would find, but still felt the weight of what he was seeing. "Mrs. Martha was right about this soil," he said. "It's different from the others. It holds minerals in a way that looks bad when you look at it from the outside, but it's exactly what the watermelon needs. It needs different management, irrigation at the right time, a seed that can take the heat without losing strength. My mother taught me what Martha told her. The rest was work. This land wasn't ungrateful, Mr. Arthur. It was just waiting for someone who knew what to ask of it." Arthur didn't answer. He stared at that immense green spreading all the way to the far end of the property, and for a long, very long moment, he said absolutely nothing. Then he spoke, with the controlled voice that men of the land learn to control early on when something hits them deep. "Silas, this land is yours. I said it, and I won't take it back." "I know," said the neighbor, "but we'll do it different." He paused a second, choosing his words. "Half of whatever comes from this harvest is yours. You're the owner of what the land holds. I only knew how to take what was already there." Arthur wanted to protest. He opened his mouth and then closed it. He looked again at those watermelons stretching all along that strip of land that had been useless for more than a decade, and he stayed quiet. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and especially subscribe to the channel. That helps us a lot who are just starting out. Now continuing. That same week, a watermelon buyer passed through the region. He was a man used to driving around farmsteads, looking at fruit on the ground and already calculating what it will yield. But when he got to the edge of the back 40 and stood looking at that field, his expression was similar to Arthur's on that Tuesday morning. He stayed quiet for a good few seconds before anything. Then he made an offer. The negotiation lasted 2 days. Silas conducted it, seated at the kitchen table of Arthur's house, with the 2 sons leaning against the wall and Arthur in a chair nearby, quiet, wearing his hat, like a partner who prefers to watch. The boys watched their father negotiate with that silent attention of someone learning something they'll need later. When everything was settled and the man left with a handshake, Silas took a paper and a pen and wrote down 2 numbers. He pushed the paper toward Arthur. Arthur's share covered the entire debt, and there was enough left over to breathe easy for the next few months. Arthur stared at that number for a time that Silas thought best not to interrupt. "I don't know how to thank you for this," he said at last. "Don't need to thank me for anything," said Silas. "Your wife planted that idea before I did. I just came after." That night, after Silas and the boys had left, Arthur stayed on the porch with a glass of cool water and the silence of the end of the day around him. And for the first time in many months, that silence didn't weigh anything. It was just silence, the kind that fits more easily in the chest. Nathan called the next day. He asked how things were, with that tone of someone asking out of obligation and expecting the usual answer. "I'm fine, son," said Arthur. "The back 40 gave watermelons this year." On the other end, there was a pause long enough to make it clear the son was trying to understand what he'd heard. "Watermelons? On that ground?" "On that ground? But how is that possible?" "Your mother already knew," said Arthur, and he hung up. A week passed. Nathan showed up again. This time without a folder, without a proposal, without Brenda. He arrived in the afternoon on a clear sky afternoon, left his truck at the entrance, and walked to the back 40 before greeting his father. He stood at the edge of the field for a good while, looking at that green that still clung to the vines that the harvest hadn't finished pulling out. And when he came back to the porch, where Arthur was sitting with his arms on his knees, he didn't say anything for a few moments. He stood on the steps, looking at his father. "So Mom knew," he said at last. "She knew. And you didn't." "I didn't." Nathan looked at his own hands. Then he spoke more quietly. "I should have stayed longer, Dad. Those times I came, I should have stayed here longer, instead of bringing papers and proposals." Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Well then, you stay now." And Nathan stayed. He stayed 3 days. This time without any rush, with no visible agenda, without the weight of someone who came to settle something. He woke up early with his father, had coffee on the porch watching the sun rise over the plants, helped carry things, did work he didn't know how to do, and learned on the spot. At night they talked without either of them forcing anything. On the last morning before leaving, Nathan went once more to the back 40. He stood still looking at what remained of the rose, already near the end of the harvest, but still with that vigorous foliage covering the ground. "It's beautiful," he said, when Arthur came slowly to his side. "It is," agreed the father. "Your mother would have liked to see that." Arthur was quiet for a moment. She already saw. She was the one who planted the idea first. We were just too slow to understand what she left. Nathan didn't answer, and for the first time in many years, father and son stood side by side looking at the same thing without either of them feeling the need to say anything else. It was the watermelons, it was the field, it was that morning light on the green, and it was Martha in all of that, quiet as she always was, present in her own way. The following week, Arthur went personally to the creditor's office. He sat in front of the same representative who had visited the farmstead months before and signed the receipt with the pen the man himself offered. He paid the entire debt, thanked him for his patience, and left. On the sidewalk he put his straw hat on his head, the brim slightly bent on the right side from how often his hand had passed over it, and breathed the hot street air for a moment before taking the first step toward the car. It wasn't victory what he felt. It was something simpler and deeper than victory. It was the feeling that the land he had spent his life on was not ungrateful. It had just needed someone who knew how to listen to what it wanted to give, just like Martha, he thought, who had been that way her whole life, keeping what she had of best for the right moment, without making noise, without asking for recognition, waiting for time to do its work. He waited a little, and time did. End of the story. I keep thinking about Martha every time I remember this story. A woman who planted an idea in silence, who kept it out of love, and who, even though she's no longer here, ended up being the person who saved everything. There is something very beautiful and very difficult about that at the same time. We never know what good things the people we love are keeping for us. Tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. Did what Martha did touch your heart in some way? Leave it in the comments. I read everything with great care. Thank you very much for your company until now. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.